getting it too,
Yeah.
since they can't get any shots or anything.
Yeah, they have been real careful, but they did go to church, not last Sunday, but the Sunday before. I guess the COVID was over and they got out.
And Molly is, I think, 11.
And Mark's youngest has already had a baby,
Right.
so that makes us
Not
great
Mark's
grand.
youngest, Scott's.
Scott's youngest has had a baby.
Grandparents.
Yeah, yeah,
There's a difference between 11 and 20.
yeah.
Morning, guys.
Brandon, the office door the office door was open when I approached it this morning, and normally it's in a closed position.
Uh-huh.
Is there something going on? I didn't notice any activity in the office, but that
Somebody just
door
left it
is
open.
always shut, but not this morning.
Well, I'm here throughout the week, and that door's open a lot, so somebody
Okay.
just left it open.
I didn't notice.
But in the morning, nobody's usually been in or out of there, but Sean was in early printing out his, because he's doing a sermon this morning, and I'm doing one, and we were using the
Okay.
printer, so we both were in and out of there, so who knows? But no alarm.
And he was done and went on down to the youth area.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say that's what it was. But you're right. It's typically closed because there's usually no one in there on Sunday mornings.
Yeah.
Usually lock it too, which is probably wise.
Yeah, well, it locks automatically when you shut it. You have to put the code in.
I like what he said, automagically.
That's right. It's one of my words that I've latched on to.
Dave does that too. Dave does it so much that we've talked about making a book called Dave-isms.
That's a good idea. That'd probably be pretty. I'd read it. I'm sure there. I know people that could write books like that probably. All right, we'll go over the bulletin, the announcements. Kids and Youth Passport meeting is going to be on Sunday, February the 6th, following the worship service in here. It says they'll be having a joint meeting for Kids and Youth Passport. Kids Passport is for students in grades 3 through 5. Youth Passport is for students grades 6 to 12. So if anybody knows a student that would like to attend that doesn't know about it or anything like that, you can come to this meeting and just get all the information about the dates and the COVID precautions and all. They're taking that stuff real seriously at the in the locations and all that, and you can pass that information on to some students who might like to come. Trivia night and soup supper has been rescheduled. I believe it was on the 30th, and now it's February the 6th. Sunday, February the 6th, that evening, I assume. It says all other details remain the same, so okay. So it'll be the evening of the 6th for trivia and soup. Still going to try to make that. I have not made one yet, and it sounds like a blast. And I do think our Sunday school class ought to be we ought to try to form a group. There's a trustee meeting on February the 8th at 6 p.m. down in room 105. Next month's February's fellowship table is scheduled for Friday, February the 11th. That's from noon to 1 p.m. You can show up a little earlier if you want. Down in the fellowship hall, $5 a ticket as usual, which you can purchase in advance, before the Sunday worship service on the 6th, the week before. It says the main entree will be roast beef, and whatever all this stuff Jan fixes and whoever else contributes to go along with it. I'm sure it'll be delicious. There is a parents' night out on February the 11th from 5 to 8:30. So you get to drop your kids off of any age in the fellowship hall and then leave. Yay. I know families enjoy that, or parents enjoy that. So if your child has friends, whose family would enjoy a night out, you can invite them as well. And it says a donation of $5 per family is requested to go towards food and supplies. And pre-registration will be available down in the narthex, but it's not required. Ecumenical Storehouse, so those deliveries, donations and pickups and stuff are starting back up. I think they've been closed for the month of January, but Saturday, February 12 is our First Baptist Church's designated day to help out. So from 9 to 12, we meet over there at the storehouse, and then we'll have tickets that have come in for donations that we will then go pick up and bring back to the storehouse. If you have any questions, Jim Williamson is the lead on that activity. February the 13th is the noisy offering, so bring all your change and everything so that we can make it loud. And the louder the noisy offering is, the funner it is, it seems. So, and this year it says this noisy offering, it says the funds will go to work in the Congo. And it says for more information on this ministry, please see the article in the January issue of the First Light. And then church council meeting on Sunday, February 13th at 2. And also on February the 13th at 3:30, there is a concert. The Oak Ridge Community Band showcase concert will be here in the sanctuary. Free concert. It says featuring band members and area musicians in small groups, trios, duos, and solos, performing a variety of music, including classical jazz, swing, contemporary, Broadway, and novelty pieces. So that sounds like a good time. All right. That was quite a few announcements, and now we're done with them. So we're missing Adrian and Gary, but that's okay. It's good to see you guys in here. It's nice to see. I mean, I love seeing everybody that comes, but we got Linda showed up for the first time in a while last week, and I like how things seem to be getting back to normal around here. So we've been doing this survey of Christian theology in here, and at this point, last week we just finished up talking about, we've been talking about God's attributes, and last week we finished up the attribute of God's omniscience, his being all-knowing, and we talked about some practical application of God's omniscience for the Christian life. And so today we're going to take a look at what's categorized as God's volitional attribute. And we talked about this last week. Volition just means will, so God's will. God has a will, and his will is expressed through his attribute of omnipotence, of his being all-powerful. According to Scripture, God is the all-powerful Lord who has created all things and sustains them by his power. And we see this, most notably in like Genesis chapter 1 with the creation of the heavens and the earth and that sort of thing. So all throughout the Bible, God is said to be, we're going to start with this, God is regularly called or described as being almighty. From Genesis all the way to Revelation, that term is used to describe God, that he is almighty. And again, the most prominent manifestation of God's, almighty power is illustrated through the act of creation out of nothing. God did not need any material or any matter or energy out of which to create the world. He creates the matter and the energy, as well as the things that are constituted in the world by matter and energy. Genesis 1 describes how God, in the beginning, God created the universe by speaking it into existence. Psalm 33:9 describes this act, saying, "For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm," speaking of God's creation of the universe. So the creation simply comes into being at the verbal command of the Lord. His almighty word, brings the universe into existence. We also see this understanding show up in the New Testament. In the book of Romans, chapter 4, verse 17, we can see how Paul, the Apostle Paul, understood God's creation of the world in this way, as creation out of nothing. In that verse, Paul describes God as one who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. So here in this little single remark where Paul's, discussing Abraham being in the presence of God, but in his remark there, Paul highlights the two, mightiest acts of God in the Bible: creation out of nothing, as far as creating the universe, and then resurrection from life, or resurrection to life from death. Nothing is the absence of anything at all, and death is the absence of life. So in both cases, God is calling something into existence, even though at that time they don't exist. And so this is why God is called Almighty. Secondly, the Bible is emphatic that God can, do anything, that there is nothing that God cannot do according to the Scriptures. God can do anything. When God tells Abraham and Sarah that Sarah will bear a child in her old age, God responds to Sarah's her laugh, her skepticism, with the words, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" It's a rhetorical question, obviously, where the answer is clearly no. Nothing is too wonderful or difficult for the Lord to do. Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, confesses this same thing in a prayer. He says, "Ah, Lord God, it is you who made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you." That's Jeremiah 32:17. And then again, Job ultimately comes to this same realization and confesses this same truth in the book of Job, where he answers the Lord saying, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." That's Job 42, verse 2. And then in the New Testament, that God can do anything is also expressed there in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 26, Jesus tells his disciples, "For mortals it is impossible, but for God all things are possible." And then again in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is praying to God, shortly before the crucifixion is to get underway, he says, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." And that's in the book of Mark, chapter 14, verse 36. So the scriptures appear to be, unequivocal regarding God's omnipotence. So let's think about omnipotence for a little bit, and kind of think through this attribute. What is omnipotence? What does it mean? What does it mean to say that God can do all things? Because it does seem intuitively obvious that there are certain things that God cannot do. It sounds awkward to say that, but I think we'll make sense of it. For example, can God act contrary to his own nature? Could God sin? Could he behave immorally? Could God create another God and then worship that God as his deity? That sort of thing. That's not conceivable, right? That's not anything we would even consider God doing. It's something we would say God cannot or would not do. Since God cannot be created, God is uncreated, he's a necessary being, he cannot create another God. And then, of course, it would be idolatrous and blasphemous for him to worship some other God. So, these things would be contrary to God's nature. So theologians, unanimously agree that God, always acts in a way that's consistent with his own nature, that he cannot act contrary to his nature. So that would be something God, that wouldn't fall under omnipotence. There are also logical possibilities to think about. Can God do something that is logically impossible? For example, can God make something both true and false? That's a logical contradiction. Could God make a square circle? These are logical impossibilities. And what you'll probably notice is that something, being both true and false, or a square circle, these aren't actually things at all. They're just words. They're a contradictory combination of words. They're nonsense, really. That's not something, there is no such thing as a square circle that God is incapable of making. Things just can't be true and false at the exact same time. So, these are not things that God's power should be expected to encompass, because they're not things at all. They're just poorly combined words. And I really only bring these up because I've heard things thrown out there before. I've heard, if God is all powerful, why can't he create something like a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? Well, if you just think about that for a minute, that's just nonsense. That's just a contradictory combination of words. It's not a real thing that you could expect to be actualized. And that gets us into like a third area. There might be things that are logically possible, but God still cannot do them for some reason.
Or chooses not to.
Yes, and that's different. We're talking about cannot. But there are logically possible things that you would say are not that God cannot actualize because they're not feasible for some reason. They end up being, you'll see. So, these are things that like William Lane Craig calls unactualizable. They are things that are logically possible, but that God can't actualize for some reason. For example, it seems logically possible that there could be a world full of people who would always freely choose to do the right thing and never sin. There's nothing illogical about that. A world of human freedom, but without sin. A world where everyone, freely chooses to obey God and that sort of thing. There is no sin. So as improbable as that sounds, there's nothing illogical about that possibility, right? There's nothing that makes that illogical. It's a logical possibility. But does that therefore mean that God is actually capable of creating such a world? Can God create a world where everyone freely chooses to do the right thing and worship God? It actually doesn't follow that he can, simply because it may be that given the existence, the reality of human freedom, there is no world that God could actualize where people just don't go wrong and sin and that sort of thing. You can think of it in this way. It's not simply up to God which world becomes actual when you bring human freedom into the mix. If people have freedom, then they kind of co-actualize the world that God creates. God has decided to create a world where he has granted human freedom. And in doing so, our freedom to choose is part of, it contributes to the world and how the world actually works, and what world God brings into existence. And so if God gives us the freedom, then he doesn't determine what we choose. We determine what we choose. We make our own choices. He stands back, God stands back in this example, so to speak, and lets us make our choices. And so what that means is that there are, logically possible worlds that God is incapable of creating. He's incapable of actualizing them because he has, brought in these limitations. Given human freedom, there are worlds which are logically possible, but they are, we would say they are unfeasible for God to actualize. So God's omnipotence doesn't necessarily, make him capable of actualizing something just because it's logically possible. It may be the case that God's desire is to include certain variables in the world that limit the possibilities of what God can actualize, can bring into reality. So there's a bit of a paradox there where, it appears to impose limits on God's power. But again, we really shouldn't think of these things as, things that God is incapable of doing, because these are purely logical limits that are placed on God's power. Even his inability to actualize a logically possible world is a logical limit, because it is it's logically impossible to make creatures freely do something. So again, this is a logical limit. It's not like an actual limitation to God's power. He has chosen it this way. So the source of the limitation here is logic. And since logic, is typically, we we would think of logic as being based in the nature of God. Logic exists because God exists, because God is logical. And so, logical limitations are really just a reflection of God's nature and how he acts in a logically consistent way. So again, not a real limitation, we can't really say that this is a lack of capability or a lack of power for God. A good definition of God's omnipotence is that God can bring about any state of affairs which is logically possible for anyone to bring about in that situation. And so the situation, for example, again, here is that humans have free will. And so it just may not have been feasible for God to bring about a world in which humans all humans always freely choose to do the right thing. So again, logical impossibilities aren't real limitations. It's a limitation that only exists in words, contradictory combinations of words again. They're not real. So when the scriptures say that God is almighty or that he can do all things, it means that he can bring about any state of affairs that is logically possible. It doesn't mean that the logically impossible can be actualized, something like a square circle or a rock so heavy that God himself cannot lift it, or God being morally imperfect, committing sin and that sort of thing. Does that make sense to you guys? You guys understand?
To me, the only reason he can't make a square circle is because that's not part of the creation he created. He could have created a creation that had that, but most of those things you're talking about are things that couldn't happen within the creation that he made.
Well, I think it's bigger than that. The square circle is nonsense. It's not logical. So I don't think God, since a square is narrowly defined and a circle is they're narrowly defined. The two cannot be the same thing. You can't even really think about a square. Picture a square circle in your mind. How many of y'all get it? I don't have one. I picture a square and a circle. So I would say that God cannot create a square circle, but that's not a limitation on God. That's because there's just no such thing as a square circle. But there are definitely things that God could create. He's just chosen not to create. But when we're talking about these logical possibilities versus logical impossibilities, we're really trying to get at, and the whole reason of really kind of emphasizing this thing is because I've seen those bad arguments, and the one with the rock is the one that I've actually seen the most. Why can God create a rock so heavy that he himself cannot lift it? It's like, that sounds kind of, ooh, can he? But if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. Because God is all-powerful. He displays all attributes to their maximal degree. And so, for one thing, if he could create a rock that he could not lift, that rock would be greater than God in some degree. It would be, it doesn't make any sense. It's a logical impossibility when you think it through. So that's kind of the reason I really wanted to hamper that, and there's lots of other arguments floating around out there, and then probably one of the biggest questions that emerges for most people, and it's a good question, is why did God create a world that has so much evil in it, that has so much wickedness? And I think that the answer to that is found in human freedom, and that our freedom, our ability to freely choose, is a limitation that God, that deals with, because obviously he chose to make us that way, right? So he placed that limitation himself for our benefit. But that does, if we are responsible, if we do make our own choices, and we do have the freedom to sin, it does seem very, quite reasonable that there just was no world in which God could create humans with free will and they didn't sin. So I think that's a good answer to that question.
When you look at the evil in the world, to me it shows how important freedom is to God, our choices.
Absolutely. Sure.
To be able to create, allow a Hitler to exist he must really, really want us to have freedom.
I agree. I think, and most free will proponents would agree with that human freedom is of the highest, value in this world. That was obviously very important to God, and probably, and part of what it means to be in the image of God, because we think of God having free will, right? And so he's given us that part of himself as well. But it's just on not so, maybe not so much on an intellectual level, but on an emotional level, the all the evil and the badness in the world, and especially for people who experience it, head on, it's really hard to deal with. So it's a very powerful question, and it's probably one of the biggest hurdles that some people have with coming to grips with there being this all-powerful, all benevolent God, is that, well, if he really does exist, why is there so many terrible things in the world? Why are there so many terrible people? And that sort of thing. It's a hard one. Anyway, I'm going to stop there, and I'll kind of stick with the same format. We'll talk about some practical application of God's omnipotence next week. But do you guys have any questions or topics, concerns, anything? Joy?
Could you just, so I just like that example as well, the example about the rock.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just say again, why is that logically impossible?
Well, because if we think of God, if God is the maximally great being, he has all these, all power, his power and his presence and his knowledge and all this, he has those to the greatest conceivable degree. Then for him to create something that is, creating a rock that is too heavy for him to lift would mean that, well, then he can create something that's stronger than him. So he can create something that actually has, has that, it's a degree beyond his capability. That rock has a capability beyond God's capability. And so if God really is the all-powerful, almighty, uncreated being, then that doesn't make any sense.
Well,
to me, that's like making a square circle. Not so much as like a square circle, because a square circle itself is illogical. A heavy rock's not illogical. But for God, so that would be similar to saying that God could make, a being that's smarter than him, or a being that's strong. That's, to me, that's the same thing as saying that he can make a rock that's weight is beyond his capability to move it or lift it.
right, but why isn't the conclusion to that therefore we can't have omnipotent things, because it's always possible for this theoretically omnipotent thing to make something bigger or smarter or whatever?
What? You mean
Yeah.
omnipotent things? I'm confused.
Well, so if it's logically possible for a being to make something bigger or greater or whatever than that thing,
I don't think that's logically possible.
why not?
Because if God is all powerful,
Well,
how do you make something that's more powerful than you?
yeah, but I think someone who would make that argument, their conclusion would be to deny that God can be all powerful.
Oh, well, sure. Well, then, yeah, your argument's fine.
And I would say to
Then
them,
he could be like us. I can make something that's heavier than I can lift. I mean, so if you deny God's omnipotence, then the problem falls apart. Yeah.
I would say to them, you're trying to create a situation where God isn't all powerful, but he is all powerful.
Right. But what Joy's saying is that, you would, if you just deny that God's all powerful, well, then sure.
You can come
It's
up
not
with a lot of
it's
things.
not much of a problem at that point.
Right, and so I think someone who's not sympathetic to, the existence of God in the first place would say, well, you've just kind of created out of nothing this thing that you claim exists that's all powerful. But here's an example that shows that something that you claim to be all powerful, that doesn't really make sense.
Well, that the idea saying that God could make a rock that He can't lift that's not evidence that there is no God. You would already be assuming God's not all powerful for that argument to work. But we're saying according to Scripture and what Christianity believes to be true, and that we have reason to believe to be true if what the Bible tells us is true, that God is all powerful. If God can create all matter and energy out of nothing, that lends to His being all powerful. And then, the Bible consistently tells us from Old Testament through all the way to Revelation that there's nothing that God cannot do and that sort of thing. So we're kind of basing, our belief in God's being all powerful and what the Bible tells us. But yeah, I mean, if you want, and there's that saying, and Lex Luthor said it in Superman, actually. If God is all powerful, then He can't be all good, and if He is all good, then He can't be all powerful. And of course, he was talking about the evil and stuff in the world, not the rock thing, but the rock I think that would kind of fall into the same degree. If you wanted to say that God is not all powerful, then sure, but I don't think you could use that as evidence. Even the one that says if He's not all good, then He can't be all powerful, but if He is all powerful, then He can't be all good. What you're arguing there is that if God is these things, there wouldn't be evil in the world, but then the Christian's answer to that would be free will, our free will.
They're really arguing, well, if He's all powerful, why isn't He not all powerful? They're giving it the opposite. It's like if we believe that black was not white, and they said, well, what if black was white? They're throwing the argument around and creating a unreasonable way of tricking us.
Yeah, well, I mean, the one with about being all good and all powerful and there being evil in the world is the only solution. God could have done that if we didn't have free will. Would be the easy answer to that. It's like,
that
yeah,
would be robots.
I think free will is the kind of unlocks the problem of that argument. So
amazing to me is He even gave the littlest creatures free will. I recently went through a period with my son where I had little tiny animals that we had, and it surprised me how much they are the same as us. Without the intellect, maybe, but
right.
That desire to live, that desire to have free will, it's ingrained even into insects.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't have any reason to believe that they don't have their own version of free. I guess it's a limited freedom in so much as far as in what they know, but that's not necessarily a limitation on your freedom. That's a limitation on anyone's freedom to do anything, is I guess where they are intellectually. But I don't know where I'm going with that now. Any other?
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
That comment is made in most cases by somebody that is probably not a Christian. It's a comment that's made by non-Christians, and it's on the internet, and some people may honestly be wanting to know the difference, wanting to know the answer, but that's how that comment kind of created.
I think probably the most difficult answer to question, or the most difficult question that you could pose would be why all the natural evils in the world, the evils that people do not whatsoever contribute to. Why does the world behave in such ways that, there's a huge earthquake and tons of people die? And there's no reason to believe that humanity or anybody contributed to there being an earthquake or that sort of thing. I think the best answer that I've ever heard to that problem, which is, and it works, is that the world really was just kind of designed to operate the way that it does on a natural level. It's just that, we're not necessarily safe from those. Those are dangers that maybe wouldn't otherwise be so dangerous if people lived in a perfect relationship with their creator and that sort of thing. But I think that's one of the more difficult questions is as far as the evil in the world, it wouldn't necessarily be why do people do evil. It's because they choose to do evil. But why those evils in the world, like those sorts of natural disasters and things that cost so many lives. Why do those things happen? Couldn't God just make it to where there were no earthquakes that killed thousands of people, or tornadoes, or floods, or that sort of thing?
Well, and actually, the world was created with rules. And as we learn more with science, we can learn more about rules of the way the world works, and we can predict when an earthquake is going to happen. To some extent, we can predict that a tsunami is going to hit a certain place because there was an earthquake, in a certain place.
Right. Yeah.
And
I think
without
there's
the natural rules that the earth follows, we wouldn't have any predictive ability.
Yeah, there are definitely that natural order of things. I mean, I guess there, if with climate change and that sort of thing, there is the argument that we contribute to some of that type of thing, that type of the pollution and stuff that we've put into the air. But that still wouldn't answer all of the
No.
earthquakes and tornadoes and tsunamis and hurricanes, and those things have been going on since long before the Industrial Revolution and the pollution that mankind is responsible for. But it does seem, you're right, there does seem to be this natural order of things, that the world undergoes these natural processes, and some of them are incredible and terrifying and devastating. And so, maybe in a certain case we would just be protected from those, whereas now we're not. That's probably the best argument I've heard for that. But that for me, that has always been the tougher of the questions. The ones that involve us are not so tough, I don't think. If you're when you bring free will into the mix. So, anything else? All right, Joy.
Well, sure. So I'm just thinking, if I were God, it seems like there should be some way to kind of maximize free. Like if you have these two different things you want to maximize, right? Free will and what?
Living right.
Yeah. It seems like there would be. I don't know. It seems like there would be some solution in the middle.
Maybe I guess you would. I could just say, what if there is no solution without some sort of, without diminishing free will? And so
there is a solution in the middle. It's called the Bible.
And so well, I mean, I think this, I guess you could just say the solution would have to be some form of determinism, where you don't really just have libertarian free will, the ability to choose whatever you want to do, whenever that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, so I've been reading Job,
Mm-hmm.
and of course his friends give all these arguments about, basically, so of course we're not supposed to.
It's your fault in
side
some
with
way, right? And it's kind of how Job's friends. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I distracted you.
Yeah. Well, so we're not supposed to think that his friends have got anything right, but so the arguments they're saying is, if people are doing evil, God steps in and stops the evil people.
Mm-hmm.
And empirically, it doesn't seem to be true
Right.
necessarily, but you think, wouldn't that, that's what a parent does, right? A kid can make decisions until the point that they're making bad decisions.
Yeah. Well, I think we probably put more. I think we put ourselves in, place limits on our children probably more so than, we will actually enforce limitations more so than maybe God will on us. And I think we should do that. There's obviously a difference between how we're managing our families and the way that God has orchestrated this world and his ultimate end, his end game, and that sort of thing. But
in terms of parallels, you can only place limits on your children for so long.
Mm-hmm.
that's true. That's true. Yeah.
In the end, you really don't have control over your children, right?
Yeah. Typically,
you
they're
can
gonna
do your very, very best, but at the end, they are also free to make their own choices.
Yeah.
No, I think there are still parallels there.
Yeah.
I think
That's a
the
good one.
concept of free will, as we're talking about it, is an absolute. It does not bear any modifications.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not free will if you try to limit it in any way.
Yeah, I guess
The opposite of free will, the absence of it, would be robots.
Yes,
creatures that
Well,
have
to
no
some
free
degree.
will.
what I'm saying is it's much less than that. If you are limited in any way, it's no longer free will. It's like you've got a huge spectrum. Free will is only the end point over on one end.
Yes,
It's not until you get to halfway or somewhere else. It's just the end point.
right. It's not. There's not like a grades of free will. There's either free will or not, and that's what. And that's definitely what we're talking about when we talk about libertarian free will, which is the kind of free will that I believe we have. That most people live as if they have libertarian free will. You know, compatibilists and you know, kind of the reformed view, which is that God has foreordained everything, and that you know, they ultimately they admit to in a sense that free will is not libertarian free will, that we don't have free will. Free will is more of an illusion, and we're just going to do the things that God has designed. God has designed the world to work in a way, and that includes everything that we're going to do. Everything that we've done has been foreordained, and so we don't really have a choice. We don't really have free will. So you do really just, it's like you said, you either have it or you don't. It's a 0 or a 1 in binary, I think, for free will. But
Yeah.
It's not very satisfying, though, is it?
No.
No.
It's-
I mean, yeah.
But I mean, I understand, like, you know, thinking about couldn't God have like balanced it, and maybe you know maybe God could have created a world where people have libertarian free will, and there is all good, but maybe that world had like 15 people in it or something. I don't know, and so you know maybe God was trying. If let's say God's another part of God's plan was to maximize the number of people who would freely come to salvation and be with the Lord and that sort of thing. So you could throw that in there. So there could be just more to it than, you know, I don't know. But so maybe God wanted to maximize that number of folks who would be saved and be with Him and spend eternity with, you know, with God and that sort of thing. I could see kind of, you know, maybe there could be that world though where there is people who just freely, you know, choose, and it was feasible, but again, maybe there was like 4 or 5 people in the whole history of that world or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I guess it's just always tempting for me to think, like, if I were God, I could do this better.
It is tempting to do that, and then you gotta like think about what you just said. You know, if I were God, it's like well, you know, stop there because. You know, I don't. You know, but I know exactly what you mean. I do the same thing. I've thought the same way, and I still think that way because that's the way I'll come up with weird questions and stuff. That's the way we question things. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but
Sometimes it's hard for me to differentiate between things that are just natural occurrences and things that